Great, thanks for having us. I'm going to be talking today about the role that middlemen play in getting goods from producers to consumers, and this is joint work with Matt Grant, who's there on the chat for all of your urgent questions. Have to be able to go forward. So the kind of context we're thinking about in this project is how something like a cell phone gets to consumers in a place like Madara, which is a smallish town in northern Nigeria. And if you spend time hanging out in markets in developing countries, you might imagine something kind of like this, right? That if you live in Madara, you go to your local shop to get a phone. Local shopkeeper probably gets cell phones from a trader, maybe in the market town for the region, Zare, about an hour and a half, 2 hours away. And that trader probably sources cell phones from a larger wholesaler in Kano, which is a regional commercial center for northern Nigeria and traditionally a hub of cross-Sahel trade. And that wholesaler probably sources phones from an importer in Lagos, right, which is the commercial capital of Nigeria and the place where most goods are imported. And maybe more surprisingly, that importer in Lagos might actually have bought the phones from maybe a trading company in Dubai. And of course, since Dubai is not really known as like a global electronics manufacturing center, almost certainly that trading company actually bought the phones from a manufacturer somewhere in southern China, right? And so this is kind of complicated. That's all very well, except that it's sort of outside of our standard trade models, which conceptualize this whole process just as this, right? There's this sort of very convenient implicit fiction that goods go directly from a manufacturer to consumers all over the world, okay? And so in this project, we're gonna do three things. So first, we're gonna show you that empirically, the reality, at least for these kind of consumer goods in Nigeria, looks a lot more like the complicated first picture than the simple second picture, okay? And the second thing is that we're going to try to offer you a conceptual framework for thinking about why these kind of long chains with multiple middlemen form and when we should expect them to form. And then finally, we're going to give you a framework for quantifying kind of what the so whats might be in terms of consumer welfare and policy, and for thinking about how far off we might be quantitatively if we're not taking this more complex reality into account. And so, this project is sort of broadly about what drives this structure of intermediation. And so let me just kind of start by saying, what do we mean by the structure of chains of intermediation? So when I say chain of intermediation, what we have in mind is a good passing through multiple hands without any transformation of the good itself, right? So this is just buying and reselling, basically. And a link on that chain for us is a transaction point where the good actually changes ownership. So it's not just, say, the physical routing of the good through roads or ports or whatever, okay? And when I say structure, what I have in mind is the number, the locations, and the competitiveness of all these links on a chain that takes a good from a given producer to a particular set of consumers. And the sort of basic conceptual insight of this paper is actually fairly simple. So the first thing we're going to do is just relax the kind of implicit assumption in a lot of trade models that if you want a particular good, you have to buy it from the firm that produced it. Right, so immediately what that's going to say is that a given good can be potentially resold in many markets by different sellers. Okay, and then if you suppose that there are also fixed as well as variable costs of trade, of sourcing goods, right? What that's going to mean is that if I'm a buyer or serving a market in a particular place, I'm faced with not just one option for where to get a particular good, but potentially a whole menu of different markets and sellers where I could source the same good, each of which are potentially going to offer different combinations of fixed and variable costs, okay? And I think it's sort of then immediately clear that direct sourcing, in the sense of buying from the original producer, doesn't have to be profit maximizing, right? It's going to depend on the prices and all of the trade costs everywhere and the quantity that I want to buy, which market is the optimal place for me to source this good. And so intuitively, the idea here is that if I'm a small shopkeeper somewhere like Madara, it's not at all obvious that it's profit maximizing for me to go directly to a manufacturer in China to buy cell phones, right? It might well be optimal for me to buy it even at a higher price in a local market town, if that reduces my fixed costs sufficiently given the scale of my operation. Okay, so that's the basic insight here. If you sort of iterate that idea, what you can get is a whole chain of buyers who are optimally sourcing indirectly from somebody who is themselves sourcing indirectly, right? And that's how you get this chain with a whole string of multiple intermediaries between a producer and a set of consumers. Okay, so I think at least one of the reasons that we maybe kind of haven't thought about this a whole lot is just that we really know very little empirically, I would say, about distribution chains, either within or across countries. And so the thing that sort of lets us get going on this project is that we have this kind of cool, unique data from the Lagos Trader Survey, which is at this point a 5-year panel study following about 1,200 wholesale and retail traders in Lagos in Nigeria who are dealing in imported manufactured consumer goods. So this is a pretty broad range of stuff, but you can think a lot of it is like clothing, shoes, electronics, cosmetics, household goods, that kind of stuff. And it's this data that's going to allow us to observe truncated, I'll tell you what I mean by truncated in just one second, chains of how these goods actually get to consumers, conditional, of course, on having at some point passed through the hands of a wholesale or retail trader in Lagos. So the first important feature of this data is that, among many other things, we observe both traders' purchases and their sales. So what that means is we can see one step upstream of these Lagos traders, who they're sourcing their goods from and where and what the features of those purchase transactions are. And in particular, we can see whether they're buying from the original producer of the product or whether they say they're buying from a wholesaler or reseller. Okay, and then we can also see one step downstream of these Lagos traders. So we see their sales, and we see a bunch of things about those transactions, but in particular, we see how many of those sales are wholesale, so to another reseller, versus retail directly to consumers. And so what that lets us do is construct this truncated measure of chain length, again, conditional on going at some point through the Lagos trader. And so you can think that the minimum chain length that we can observe here has length 3. And so that would be a chain where we talk to the Lagos trader and they say that they buy directly from the manufacturer and they have 100% retail sales directly to consumers. And so that's a chain of length 3, right? The original producer, the Lagos trader, who's the one intermediary, and the final consumer. You can think the maximum chain length that we can observe, right? Not that exists in reality, but that we can observe here is a chain of length 5. So that's one where we talk to a Lagos trader. We see that they buy entirely from upstream wholesalers, right? So not at all from the original manufacturer, and they sell entirely wholesale, so not at all to final consumers. And so then we know that there have to be at least 3 intermediaries in this chain, right? The Lagos trader, the intermediary upstream of them, and the intermediary downstream of them, as well as an original producer and a final consumer for a total chain length of 5, right? And of course, in that situation, what you can think is that, we just don't see what's going on more than one step upstream and one step downstream, right? So there's sort of question marks on either end here. This could actually be a chain of length 7, right? But we only observe 5 links. So that's what I mean by a truncated measure, okay? Regardless of the actual length of the chain, we're never going to observe more than 5 steps. Okay, so when we put that all together, what we can see is that even with this very truncated measure, average chains in this context are quite long. So typically there is at least one upstream and one downstream intermediary in addition to these Lagos traders. We can also see a lot of features of these traders and their transactions, and I'll show you just on the next slide a little bit of what I mean, but we can see that both the features of the traders themselves and the transactions they engage in, both upstream and downstream, vary systematically with their position on the chain, okay? And we can also see that it sort of looks like these guys maybe are just one link on a chain that in fact does continue further downstream. So I don't know if you guys can see this map here, right? But what we can see is that about half of these trader sales are actually to places outside of Lagos, right? Including some big hotspots in kind of the major regional centers of Nigeria. So you can see up here, Kano, that I was talking about. What we don't know right now is to what extent those sales really are going to like retailers in Kano, just selling to customers there, and how much of it is, you know, going out here to Azare and Madara somewhere. And you know, hopefully someday when we can start up field work again, we have things lined up to continue tracing those chains further downstream so we can get you an answer to that question. Okay, but what we can see in the current data is a bunch of patterns about how these traders and transactions relate to their position on the chain. So the first thing that we can see is that upstream position and downstream position are systematically and negatively related. So in this first column here, what we're seeing is that the closer you are to the original manufacturer, the further you tend to be from final consumers. Okay, and that's not mechanical, right? So if you look at work by Antras and Shore, who are looking at value chains across industries and countries, they actually find the opposite, that some firms just tend to be on longer chains than others, and so actually these are positively correlated. In our case, these are negatively correlated. The second thing that we can see is that traders who are further upstream, so this in the sense of closer to the original manufacturer, are larger firms, okay? And even conditional on that, those that are closer to final consumers, so they're further downstream, are smaller firms. And this holds if you look at other measures of firm size, including how many employees they have and so on, okay? The third thing, okay, is that firms that are closer to the original manufacturer, okay, get lower unit costs, okay? And that's even holding fixed how far they are from final consumers. So this is what they pay for their goods when they buy from their own suppliers. The final thing is that they also charge, I just said some of this backwards. This is how many steps are downstream of the trader. Okay, so this is when there are more steps downstream of you, you are further from the final consumer. So I was pointing at the wrong thing when I said that. So when you are further from the final consumer, you also charge lower markups when you sell your goods. And that's even conditional on how far you are from the original manufacturer and the price that you pay to your supplier, okay? And I'll come back to these facts when we sort of talk about how we set up the quantitative model, but these are going to motivate the way we want things to work. And in particular, you should think of these differences in prices paid and prices charged as motivating the way we're going to set up elasticities of demand passing along the chain, okay? So what I want to do next is sort of offer you a quite general and quite simple conceptual framework for thinking about what's going on here that generates these chains. We're going to start by having a super simplified geography that lets us be really general. So this is sort of not relying on any particular specification of demand or competition. And I'm going to show you that essentially all of the kind of so what's of this paper about consumer welfare and about implications for measurement of trade costs actually come out of this really general, really simplified setting. Okay, they're not reliant on any particular specification. That, of course, is still not going to be very useful for trying to quantify things. And so after that, what we're going to do is move to a more general geography, but kind of a less general setup so that we can think about how to quantify things. But I do want to emphasize that kind of all of the general implications come out of even this really simple version. So what we're thinking about is a world with only 3 locations. So one is the origin where a single good is produced. Let's just say for now it's some exogenous price, okay? And then there are going to be 2 locations with consumers who demand that good. Moving goods between any pair of these locations is going to incur both a fixed cost of trade, okay, and a variable cost. And consumers in each of the 2 locations are going to be served by some endogenous number of traders, okay? And what traders do is they can source the good from any location and they can resell it in their home location without transforming it, right? And one thing that is key is that we're going to let them sell in their home location only, even though they can source it from anywhere. And what that's going to mean is that they may face demand both from their local consumers in location I but also from downstream traders who may show up from some other location J to source the good there, okay? And I'm gonna sort of, there's not actually much more detail here. As I said, this is fairly unspecified. I'm gonna skip a little bit here. So we're gonna let traders in each location enter up to 0 expected profits. They're gonna choose a source location to buy the good, pay trade costs, bring the good home, set prices to maximize their profits. And it's important here that we're allowing for these traders to be imperfectly competitive in their resale market at home. Okay, and what that means is just sort of by definition, a given trader in location I who has set retail and wholesale prices, who chooses to source from location J, right, is going to earn profits that are related to the markup they're charging on retail sales and the number of consumers who show up to buy from them, the markup they're charging on wholesale sales and the number of downstream traders from another location who show up to buy from them, the fixed costs they pay given the location they chose to source from, and some fixed cost of entry. Right, and it's important here that the cost that they pay themselves is going to be related to the wholesale price being set in their chosen source location and the trade costs to get it back. So let's just sort of, for the sake of illustration, consider only symmetric equilibria with identical traders, right? So all of the traders in a given location are choosing an equilibrium to do the same thing. And there are two types of equilibria we want to think about here. So one is an equilibrium in which all the traders in both of the consumer locations choose to source directly from the origin. And we're calling that a direct sourcing equilibrium. The second kind is one in which the traders in one of the downstream locations source from the origin, and the traders in the other downstream location source from that other downstream location, right? So something we're going to call the hub sources from the origin, and the final destination sources from the hub. Okay, and obviously it doesn't matter which one is which, and we're calling that an indirect sourcing. So to sort of illustrate what the welfare implications for consumers are, what we want to do is compare, let's say that we're in a world where there happens to be an indirect sourcing equilibrium. And then think about what happens in a counterfactual world where we impose direct sourcing, right? So let's start putting this in the real world. Suppose Lagos is the final destination. There are also consumers and traders in Dubai, which is the hub, and the origin is Guangzhou, where goods are being produced. What we're saying is that originally there was some equilibrium where Lagos sourced from Dubai, Dubai sourced from Guangzhou, and now we're going to disallow that exogenously. We're going to tell Lagos, if you want the good, you have to buy directly from the origin, okay? And there are two sort of major implications of cutting out the middleman in Dubai exogenously that way, right? So the first is that in general, we should expect consumers in the hub in Dubai to lose out, okay? Because effectively the market in Dubai has gotten smaller, right? And so there are going to be fewer traders operating there. And so if we're in any kind of world where consumers have gains from either seller variety per se, or where there are pro-competitive effects of having more sellers in the market, consumers in Dubai were better off in the world where they were serving a larger effective market and there were more traders. And when you cut out the ability of downstream demand to source there, they're going to lose, okay? The second implication, which I think is maybe less intuitive, is that it's actually ambiguous whether consumers in Lagos are going to be better or worse off, okay? And so what that's going to depend on is sort of the balance of two opposing forces. So what I'm doing here is comparing the consumer price in Lagos in this kind of original indirect sourcing world, okay, to the equilibrium that arises with imposed direct sourcing. And what you can see here is the passed-through variable trade cost is necessarily lower if we assume there are some triangle inequalities applying to trade costs, which you don't need to do. But if we're being conservative and assuming they are, they're necessarily going to be better off in terms of pass-through trade costs, right? It's kind of mechanically cheaper to get goods somewhere directly than it is to get them there indirectly. They're also going to be better off because any markup that was originally being imposed in the hub location and getting passed through to them is now no longer there, okay? The countervailing force is that because we sort of force traders who by revealed preference originally wanted to source indirectly to source directly, there are going to be fewer profits in the home market. Some of them are going to exit, right? And again, if there are any sort of gains to consumers from either seller variety or pro-competitive price effects, here we're just calling them price effects, then prices at home in Lagos are going to go up, okay? And so Whether a shorter chain is better or worse for consumers could go either way, and it's basically going to depend on whether these reductions in pass-through trade costs and markups are higher, or whether the increase in at-home prices is higher, okay? And that's sort of one of the main points here. I think a lot of the people's instinct is often that these kind of non-productive intermediaries who are charging markups must be bad for consumers, and what we're saying here is they might be. They might also not be. Consumers may actually gain from pro-competitive effects of a longer chain with more intermediaries, even when they're charging markups. Okay, second thing that we think is useful here is that this can, thinking about things this way can potentially help us reconcile some pretty long-standing empirical puzzles from the literature. So, without getting too much into details, right, some broad observations that have been around in literature for a long time. So one is that there are big price gaps, especially in developing countries, between producers and consumers, okay? That sort of implies in a variety of settings that distance costs must be really high. When we try to actually get into the nitty-gritty and explain why distance costs or trade costs are so high with things like, road quality or whatever it is, they still seem to be higher than we can really kind of explain with these observables. Okay, so we're kind of left with a puzzle. And so people have often said, okay, well, maybe this is about market power, right? That these price gaps are really about high markups along the way rather than distance cost per se. And I'll just say that the evidence on that is at least mixed, right? There's sort of no smoking gun evidence that these large price gaps are necessarily accounted for by markups as opposed to distance costs everywhere. And so we're kind of left with a puzzle about why distance costs seem so high and why these price gaps are so big. And we think that thinking about these long intermediation chains can potentially help reconcile all these facts. And so what you want to think about here is suppose that developing countries and maybe even more remote places within developing countries are more likely to be served via long chains, okay? Then you get three implications. So the first is maybe the most mechanical, right? Which is just that if goods arrive at a destination via more indirect routes in developing countries or in more remote places, then the distance that goods actually travel is higher than the shortest distance, right? And that means that they are in fact incurring high trade costs, but the cost per unit of distance across the shortest route is not actually higher, right? So this is just sort of a pure, the goods aren't going the way you think they are. And so when we sort of, put those total trade costs on what we measure as the root, we're getting the wrong answer. Okay, the second thing is slightly less intuitive, right? Which is that in a world with indirect distribution chains, there's actually more trade between some pairs of locations than we think there is, right? So if locations on a distribution chain are closer to one another on average than the origin where the good was actually produced and the final destination where the consumers are, then trade from nearby places is going to look higher than it really is, and trade from further away places is going to look lower than it really is, right? So what I mean by that is that we would observe, for instance, a lot of trade between Kano and Azare, and almost no trade between Azare and China, when in fact all the goods in Azare are being produced in China. Right, and then if we run some kind of gravity regression, what we're going to see is very little trade across faraway places and a lot of trade across nearby places, right? And that's going to lead us to incorrectly infer that the distance cost is quite high, when in fact, this is really all about fixed costs. Okay, the final thing that I won't get into the details on is that even if we're sort of doing something pretty sophisticated and trying to correct observed price gaps for different pass-through, for instance, in like a great Atkin and Donaldson paper, if we don't observe the intermediate steps along the route, we're going to end up overcorrecting essentially for pass-through on costs incurred and later legs on the chain, and that's also going to lead us to overstate trade costs. So again, I won't get into the details there, but this is sort of saying kind of no matter what method we're currently using in the literature, it's likely that if we're not accounting for these chains of intermediation, we're probably overstating trade costs, probably especially in developing countries. Okay, so the last sort of section of this paper is, so there are potentially ambiguous welfare implications. We're potentially overestimating trade costs in developing countries. We might want to know how much. on both of those fronts. And so we're going to try to put this into a quantifiable framework that we can actually take to data. Okay, so the conceptual insight here was really simple. Making it quantifiable, maybe not surprisingly to many people in the audience here, is a huge mess. It's not at all tractable. So I'm not going to be able to show you the whole model, but let me sort of try to summarize what we think are kind of the key assumptions and tricks we're using here to make this run. So the first challenge, right, is this is immediately a horrible combinatorial optimization problem with many locations if we move into a general geography, okay? And so we're going to deal with that by making traders small and heterogeneous so that we end up getting positive flows along all chains, right? So what that means is that if you're a trader traders in Lagos are going to end up sourcing from all possible locations, and sort of the margin here is going to be how much is being sourced, not whether anything is being sourced. The second challenge is that when you have many different types of buyers showing up in a market with different elasticities of demand, which themselves depend on the elasticities of demand for everybody downstream of them, a pure strategy pricing equilibrium within a market may not exist. And the way we're going to get around that is to allow chain-specific price discrimination, and I'll try to show you briefly what I mean by that. And the final thing is sort of, as I was just saying, this all gets super complicated if you want to allow the elasticity of demand to depend on everything that's happening in the downstream chain. We think is sort of realistic and important for matching some of the empirical facts that I showed you earlier. And so what we're going to do here is we've sort of found a way to allow the buyer-seller match value within a market to depend on a Fouché draw in a way that makes the elasticity of demand a tractable recursive function of everything that's happening downstream. So I'll show you a little bit more of what I mean. Okay, so the environment we're in here is actually pretty simple at first to the simple model I showed you. So we still have just a single good sold at some exogenous price in an origin location. Okay, but we're now going to allow there to be an arbitrary number of consumer locations, okay, each of which has some fixed measure of consumers with some exogenous expenditure on the good, okay? Each of those is going to be served by some endogenous measure of traders. So note that we've sort of moved here from potentially a small number of traders to everywhere being served by a measure of small traders. We're still going to be in a world where moving goods between any pair of locations incurs some fixed and some variable trade cost, okay? But we're now going to drop the assumption that these traders are all identical within a location, so we can now get two-way trade and complex chains and all sorts of messy things. Okay, so a measure of sellers in any given market I is going to sell to consumers, and they face these sequential choices. So first, they're going to decide whether to pay a fixed cost of entry. Then they're going to observe some idiosyncratic component of the fixed cost they face to source from any particular source market. Then they're going to choose based on that which market they want to source from. Then within that market, they're going to observe some idiosyncratic component of their match value with individual sellers who are selling the good in that market. Then they're going to choose which of those sellers to buy from. Okay, they're going to pay trade costs to bring the good home, and then they're going to choose to set prices in their home location. Okay. And so in this world, what is a chain? A chain is going to be a unique sequence of links, right? Which again are transactions where the good actually changes ownership, through which the good reaches consumers in some location I, okay? And so we're going to denote a chain with Z that has some length big NZ, right? Where the first step is always the origin, okay? And the final step is necessarily the location of sale to final consumers, okay? And we can talk about kind of any nth link along that chain. And in this world, the trader is going to participate in all the chains through which goods go from their chosen source market to their home market. Okay? And I'm going to, sorry guys, skip some of the details here for the sake of time, but I would sort of want to get a little bit into the details on what we mean by chain-specific pricing. So as I said, we're going to allow sellers to price discriminate at the chain level. Okay, and what that's going to mean is that buyers are actually going to get a match at the seller chain level, right? So I'm going to sell on a bunch of chains. Some stuff is going to consumers in my home location. Some of it is going to traders who show up from other places to sell further downstream. And I'm going to get a draw for a match with a seller for each of those chains. That's going to make their pricing decisions separable across chains, right? And this is what's going to give us this pure strategy pricing equilibrium within a market, okay? The second thing that's going to do for us is let us make the form of pricing and demand quite tractable at each step. So the first observation here is that at each step, wholesale demand has a CES form if downstream demand at the steps below it also have CES form, okay? So if consumer demand at the final level is CES, then by induction, every step along the chain is also going to have CES form demands, okay? And what that's going to mean is that pricing is going to end up working out really nicely. So you can think that at the retail level, imagine like a sort of discrete choice problem where consumers are choosing a seller and they get some Gumbel match draw that's going to generate effectively CES demands, right? What you can see here is that there's going to be an elasticity of demand that depends on the dispersion of their idiosyncratic preference across sellers, right? So the higher the dispersion of this draw, the lower the elasticity of demand at the consumer level, okay? And if we think about there being a similar sort of discrete choice at every single level, then the elasticity of demand at each step, so at step N on chain Z, is going to be a function of the elasticity of wholesale demand one step below at step N+1, okay, and the dispersion of this idiosyncratic match between buyers and sellers at step N. And so this is going to have this sort of nice recursive form where we can have sort of prices and demands work out well at every step in the chain. Okay, I apologize that I'm going to skip a whole bunch of other steps about how this quantifiable model works, but let me just sort of highlight what I think we're getting out of this that is fitting the world in a realistic way. So the first thing is that this model is going to feature double marginalization, right? So markups are going to compound along the chain, and total surplus in this world would increase if somehow traders could integrate or coordinate on pricing along the chain, right? So we're charging markups over markups at each step. The second thing, which I've already sort of hit on quite a bit, right, is that the pricing structure is going to be CES, but with chain-specific elasticities. So elasticities are going to be increasing, and therefore markups decreasing as you move upstream along a chain. So if you remember sort of back to the beginning, some of the empirical facts I was showing you, this is letting us capture why the closer you are to the original manufacturer and the further you are from final consumers, you're paying lower prices and you are yourself charging lower markups, okay? And the final thing is that this model is going to feature entrepot effects, right? So as more downstream locations show up to buy in a given market, that's going to induce entry of intermediaries in that market, which is going to make that market itself a more appealing place that's going to draw in more downstream demand. So we're going to see these sort of hubs or entrepot locations like Dubai and Lagos kind of endogenously appearing in this world. So what do we want to do with this? What we're doing right now is what I would say is maybe an informed simulation of distribution of apparel from China through Dubai and Lagos and 7 other cities we've chosen in Nigeria. As I kind of hinted at earlier, there's a lot we don't observe about what's going on in the entirety of Nigeria, right? We don't actually see these chains all the way down to consumers in places outside Lagos. But what I can say right now is that we're sort of matching a lot of the facts that we observe in Lagos and one step upstream and one step downstream with sort of reasonable parameter values that we're actually taking from our data, okay? So what we can get from this is some preliminary estimates of sort of how much chains might matter for consumer welfare in different places, right? And how far off our estimates of distance costs or trade costs in a place like Nigeria might be. And that's going to kind of get us a step toward thinking about policy decisions that might affect fixed costs of trade, like for instance, what would happen if China made it cheaper for Nigerians to buy there directly, right? Or what would happen if you had policy that affected intermediaries or middlemen directly, as many developing countries do. Okay, so I'm going to sort of skip a lot of what we're plugging in here, but this is kind of what we get out. We can model how trade flows in this world are going to work. So you can see everything's coming from China originally. A lot of it goes directly to Dubai or directly to Lagos. Smaller amounts go directly to smaller cities. And then you see Lagos sort of acting as the secondary hub after China and Dubai and sending stuff to all of these tertiary locations throughout Nigeria. And you see a little bit of Ibadan and Kano, which are relatively big regional centers, also serving smaller places in their regions. Okay. So, you know, I think we're kind of doing surprisingly well at this point, given the limited structure of this model at actually matching what we're seeing. So you can see these are sort of the moments that we actually see in our data. And these are what we're getting out of the model, right? So we're kind of matching the truncation that we see in the data here. And in fact, you can see that we are getting on average about one intermediary upstream and one downstream of Lagos traders, right? We're sort of matching where they're buying from. And we're matching a lot of these facts that I was mentioning about the sorting of traders of different sizes into different steps on the chain, and these elasticities and prices varying systematically along the chain as well. And so what we're just starting to do now is sort of think about basic counterfactuals, right? Like what would happen if you did this really simple counterfactual I mentioned earlier and you just cut out all the middlemen. You said everybody has to source directly, right? And what you're getting is that sort of the further downstream you are in the original equilibrium, the more you lose from that, right? So Lagos isn't too terribly affected because Lagos was mostly sourcing directly from China already, but a place like Bauchi, which is a much smaller city in northern Nigeria, is actually doing really badly from that. We can also see that our trade costs might be really off, right? So in a more remote place, the actual trade costs incurred in the indirect sourcing equilibrium might be as much as twice as what they would be if we assumed that everybody was sourcing directly. And I do want to sort of give a little bit of a caveat on these numbers right now. In order to sort of keep agglomeration economies from blowing up, we're not doing a great job of matching wholesale markups right now. And so we're sort of working on fixing that. And I think you may get that the welfare implications for a place like Bauchi are less dire as we fix that. So I don't want you to get too hooked on these specific numbers, but I think this sort of gives you an idea of what we're doing to operationalize this model. Okay, so let me just sort of end by saying, you know, I think the kind of real motivation here is that we're seeing empirically that goods in a place like Nigeria actually are distributed via these kind of long chains. And we don't currently have any framework for thinking about why or when or where that's going to happen in the literature. And so what we're trying to do is sort of provide one that explains how the structure of these chains of intermediation might arise endogenously, right? And how that might relate to measuring trade costs and policy choices in consumer welfare. And we think that the answer is that it's probably causing us, on average, to overestimate trade costs in developing countries, right? It may also kind of want to make us think twice about some of the knee-jerk policy reactions to middlemen, right? That even when middlemen are not productive per se or transforming goods, they're just playing an aggregation role. They don't have to be, they're not necessarily, right? But they can actually be good for consumers by sort of allowing for these pro-competitive effects in smaller markets. And I think sort of broadly what this suggests is that in developing countries, we want to maybe think more about the substance of these fixed costs and not just the kind of variable trade costs related to things like you know, transportation costs and tariffs and so on that we often think about. Our hunch is that this is probably especially important in developing countries, right? But we actually don't have systematic data on these kind of chains across, you know, the US versus Nigeria that would let us compare that. And so I think there's also maybe a need for sort of more data to try to get into how this varies empirically around the world. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Because we're open to questions. Ezra will be the commissary of questions.
So I guess I could start with a question. Oh, there's a question from Hannes. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, super interesting work and very plausible sounding. I just thought about the implications. So the story you're describing sounds quite a lot about what like Alfred Chandler wrote about the US economy in the mid-19th century, that, you know, it was a lot of big intermediation chain, small trading companies, like one in St. Louis, one in New Orleans, then one in Liverpool, then one in London and so forth. And then it became transformed by vertical integration and like the mailing order companies and so on. So I think this sort of just out of pure curiosity, when you chat with these traders and so on, what prevents this avoiding the double marginalization by vertically integrating the chain? So why is like no DHL or anyone like sort of sitting in Dubai and just like coordinating the flows? Is that like, yeah, uncertainty about demand, or what is your sense like after having been with the Lagos traders for a long time, why this is not happening?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the Chandler point is really well taken. And if anybody happens to know things or have data on this in a historical context in the US, I would love to talk to you. But setting that aside, let me distinguish sort of two things from what you just said. So DHL is not necessarily a solution here, right? Because what you need is not a network solving the physical transport problem, right? What you need is sort of integration of ownership and pricing. And so DHL only solves the problem if what we mean by that is they're really reducing the fixed costs of sourcing from China, such that a small trader somewhere can actually buy directly from China, and then DHL deals with all the physical logistics of getting the goods to them, right? But if DHL is still charging sort of a big fixed cost to get you goods from there, or if there are other fixed costs associated with finding a supplier or having a bank or some financial service that enables you to do that transaction, then DHL doesn't solve the problem, right? And so I guess there's sort of a broader question about why we're not seeing integration or larger firms that have integrated distribution networks. I think that's a totally fascinating question. When you talk to traders about this, I think you get the answers you might expect, right? That like, sure, they'd love to scale up. If they could be bigger, they would.
We don't have much money.
Yeah, they don't, right? And if you ask sort of why aren't people just kind of collaborating in some loose cooperative way, I think the answer is there are all sorts of like, the sort of competitive and contracting problems you would imagine with that, right? And so, actually, really interestingly, ShopRite, which is a big South African grocery and retail chain, expanded into Nigeria a bunch, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, and they've been pulling back, and they have actually just a couple weeks ago finally pulled out entirely. So there must be some kind of countervailing span of control, something problem, right, that's kind of preventing a big firm with an integrated distribution network from coming in and doing that effectively. And I don't know the answer, but I think that's like a totally fascinating area for future thinking. Sorry, that was a longer answer, Hannes.
No, that's super interesting. A lot, yeah.
So I have one question about the way you're thinking about measuring fixed versus variable costs. So I guess I had asked a question in the chat, and Matt answered that the way you're measuring markups is the price you get versus, I guess he said it's the price you pay plus trade costs. And you make the nice point, I guess, that some trade has fixed costs, some has variable costs, and I guess how you're thinking about, I guess the implications for pass-through and stuff depends on a lot on, I think, on splitting up trade costs into those two components.
Yeah. So what we measure empirically right now has two parts. So we see what they paid to get the good back into the country. So that's generally going to have transportation and any kind of tariff or port costs they faced. And then we see some things about other costs they faced. So that might include traveling to China. It might include hiring an agent, things like that. And so right now what we're doing is that we're calling basically all of the transport and port costs variable costs. And we're not calling the other stuff fixed costs in the sense that that's never entering empirically into what we're doing. We're actually sort of inferring what fixed costs must be from observed behavior. But you're right that there is sort of an assumption in there that we can allocate the transport costs to be variable costs. And if we fiddled with that, we would get, if we thought that some part of that was actually like fixed port fees, we would get a slightly different answer about what markups are.
I think if there's another question right away, I will ask one. So you mentioned that, without a lot of the continuous assumption and randomness of fixed costs and so on and so forth, it's impossible to solve the model for the actual geography. But what do we know about how good that assumption, or how sensitive results will be, I guess, if you were to be focusing on a more simple environment? How you play, I guess I can imagine a simple environment that will be feasible to work out in a more discrete, finite set up, and then there compare how things will be vis-a-vis the more continuous one.
Yeah, so Matt may be better suited to answer this question than me. My sort of understanding from earlier trade literature is that this is sort of why we all went to Ricardian continuums, is the answer is that you can't do much.
No, but for some setup, you might be able to do some, and then you may say, well, or for example, in the application yesterday on cement, there might be the number of options would be very limited, and one can imagine characterizing it more in both ways. But
yeah, that's it. I mean, I think we potentially could try sort of working through a really simple quantified example in the discrete world. You know, in the setting we're in right now, we actually do have large numbers of firms, right? So if you ask like how many intermediaries in Lagos are buying clothing from China or Dubai and selling it in Lagos, the answer is thousands, right? And so I guess we sort of thought that there wasn't necessarily that much to gain from trying to be in like a sort of Corno world with 4 locations. But we haven't tried that, and it's possible that we could sort of like work out some relatively straightforward math in the simple world and see how far off that is.
Question from you, Hey?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith and Matt. I just have a question about whether you have any plan on more realistic policy counterfactual. And so the counterfactual direct sourcing is interesting, but it's like very counterfactual. And I'm particularly wondering if it's practical from the policy maker's perspective, if they want to restrict entry versus want to control prices.
Sorry, can you elaborate just on that last bit? What do you mean about entry versus prices?
So the counterfactual that you showed about direct sourcing, if I understand correctly, is shutting down entry as a middleman. Maybe not, or
I see. No, so actually what we're doing is we're restricting where traders can source from. So we're not restricting entry per se. What we're saying is that if you want to enter and source this good, you have to source it from China. You can't source it from Lagos.
I see.
But I think maybe if the broader point is, you know, is that the realistic policy counterfactual? I think probably no, which I assume is what you're getting at. I think, so the reason that we started there is, I think that, you know, with the caveat of, I think sort of the numbers aren't quite right yet, that's the answer to kind of how much does accounting for these intermediation chains matter, right? Like how far off are we compared to our usual models, which just implicitly assume that everybody has to be buying directly from China, right? So that's why we were doing that, not because that's the realistic policy counterfactual. I think the other ones we've been sort of holding off on getting into anything too realistic until we think our numbers are approximately right. So we are extremely open to suggestions on what you guys think would be the most interesting policy counterfactuals. What we've had in mind are thinking about policies that affect either the fixed or variable costs of trade, right? So, you know, if China helps build a railroad between Lagos and Kano, what does that do? Or if visas to China get cheaper, so that reduces the fixed cost of sourcing from China, right? What does that do? And obviously that affects both traders in Lagos and traders in Kano. And so it's kind of not obvious ex ante how things are gonna shake out. You know, one area where I think we don't quite know what to do yet, but it is realistic, is like developing countries do have like pretty weird policies often about restricting middlemen, right? So, you know, a few people, I don't know if they're here, have sort of written papers about like India actually trying to shut down a whole layer of oilseed middlemen, right? So that's not actually like totally crazy. Probably they're not saying literally you have to buy from China, you can't buy from Lagos, but I think we would like to think about what do some of these policies that are more directly intended to control intermediation markets do. And so if anybody has suggestions about that, we would love to hear it.
Thank you.
Just 2 quick questions. One was on product availability. So I was thinking about this literature on the cost of remoteness. and how you're thinking about that. And so what role do these traders play and how that affects your results? And the second was that in terms of policies that shut down traders, I think Ethiopia did that not too long ago, completely shutting down markets, because I with somebody else was thinking about doing a survey of traders just before they did that. And if the Ethiopian government wants to do that, they do that. So in terms of, I don't know what data are available around that, but that might be something worth looking at. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Ethiopia is always also interesting, right? Because on the one hand, there are data on traders, and on the other hand, there are data on officially licensed traders, which is exactly subject to the issue you're talking about. But that's a great idea. We should look more closely at that data. So I guess the first part was about remoteness and product availability. Yeah, that's sort of one of the things we were thinking about early on in this project, right? Is right now we're operating in a model, even the quantifiable version of the model, with one good. And I think sort of intuitively, if you expand to multiple goods, and you get like a margin of traders deciding how many goods to trade, you get all sorts of interesting implications, some of which I think will indeed be about lower product availability in more remote places, and that allowing for indirect trade probably promotes greater product variety, right? That like, if you have to buy directly from China, you can only afford to trade in kind of the most popular goods, right? Whereas if you can have lots of little traders buying from the local market town, then you can afford to deal in things that are kind of have smaller demand relative to the fixed costs. We have not written down that model yet because the tractability issues and even getting to this point have been larger than we originally thought when we started on this project, but I would love to go there in the future.
Perfect.